Croeso I Gymru, welcome to Wales. I would say I am not in Wales. I'm currently standing in England on the county of Gloucester. Wales, if you can make it out on this lovely sunny day, is just behind me, so ignore the cows. Chepstow is just over there. I tried to get a shot of Chepstow Castle, but weather conditions and certain traffic events prevented me from doing so. But yes, welcome to Who Resisted the Vikings the Best in Britain, the Wales version. So what I'm currently standing nearby is Offa's Dyke, which would have existed during the Viking Age in and around Wales and England. Now it was constructed, we think, by Offa of Mercia, King of Mercia, who was a real menace to the Welsh, especially before the Viking Age.
Wales, like England and Scotland in the early Middle Ages, isn't formed as such, although Wales is a unique case in Britain, as unlike England and Scotland, the Vikings didn't have the same impact on how the kingdoms of Wales would form over the course of the Viking Age. There's no Danelaw like in England, or the Viking kingdom of the Isles in Scotland, so there's no Viking kingdoms in Wales. However, the Norse did try and settle into Wales at various points, which I'll go over. Now, as I did with England and Scotland, let me introduce the sources. Wales, like Scotland, has a short chronicle account titled The Annals of Wales, written in the High Middle Ages, but again, I'll be referring to a lot of other sources that mention the Vikings in Britain, and as this is the final episode of Who Resisted the Vikings in Britain the Best, I'm going to use some other sources that mention the Vikings across the world, such as this description of the Norse from Ahmad ibn Fadlan. I have seen the Rus as they came on their merchant's journey and encamped by the Volga. I have never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Each man wore a garment which covered his body on one side and left one side free for action. Each man carried an axe, a Frankish-type sword, and a knife with him. Tattoos covered him from fingertip to neck. They drink wine excessively, day and night. As for the first time the Vikings appear in the Welsh sources, we have this quote: 796, the first coming of the Gentiles, Norsemen, among the southern Irish. That is all that is recorded in the Welsh annals until the middle of the 9th century. 835, Mona wasted by the Black Gentiles. Mona being Anglesey in North Wales, which on a clear day, Ireland is visible from Anglesey, and with the Norse settling and conquering parts of Ireland, Anglesey was a prime target. However, the king who controlled Anglesey, King Rhodri, would later distinguish himself and cement a legacy as a great Welsh leader. Rhodri himself would create a dynasty that nearly controlled all of Wales. For example, he's one of the few kings to defeat and kill a Viking leader in Britain. Quote, Orm, chief of the Dark Foreigners, was killed by Rhodri, son of Mervyn, King of Wales. That's quite an achievement considering it's the early part of the Viking Age. Some of the chroniclers always imply that the Norse had some sort of invincibility. However, the Norse were always a reoccurring threat, and by 877, Rhodri for a time fled his kingdom as the Norse managed to occupy Anglesey. At this point in Welsh history, Anglesey was a vital area for grain crops, but this is also the time of the activities of the great heathen army across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the settlement of the Isles around Scotland. But for Wales, there are attempts at settlements, the major one being of course Anglesey, as its prime real estate for the Norse. With the Welsh kingdoms, it is fair to say that while the impact of the great heathen army is negligible, as there's no evidence suggesting the heathen army even came close to the Welsh kingdoms, the actions of the heathen army did benefit the Welsh kingdoms to a degree. As with a weaker Mercia, the kingdoms had one less major rival to contend with, as gleaming over the Welsh annals before and after the appearance of the Vikings, it's clear that the kingdom of Mercia, especially under King Offa, was a tremendous threat to the independence of the Welsh kingdoms. For example, 778, the devastation of South Britons by Offa. 784, the devastation of Britain by Offa in the summer. The Welsh kingdom of Powys would suffer a large amount of the brunt of these assaults, but many of the Welsh kingdoms would come under the control or merge with other Welsh kingdoms over the course of the Viking Age in Britain, so unintentionally, the Vikings have made a dramatic impact on the kingdoms of Wales without actually being present in Wales. Now, St. David's is one of Wales's holiest sites and was one of the largest monastic places during the Middle Ages, which, like Lindisfarne and Iona, attracted many raiders, and no surprise, St. David's would suffer many attacks from the Norse. The most devastating raid by the Norse from the Welsh annals occurred in 895. We can make an assumption it was a widespread raid across Wales, mainly in the south of Wales. However, we can only speculate which Norse these were. Norse from Ireland or Scotland, or even further from Scandinavia. Or the raid could have been one of vengeance, as in 893 a joint force of Welsh and Anglo-Saxon forces defeated a major Danish fleet, although the Welsh are barely mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon accounts, as while the forces were gathering, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles simply states, and also a certain part of the Welsh race. The next attempt on a Norse settlement on Anglesey was done by the Norse based in Dublin, from the Annals of Ulster, 902 AD. The heathens were driven from Ireland, i.e. from the fortress of Islandbridge, by Irishmen whose names I cannot pronounce, and they abandoned a good number of their ships and escaped half dead after they had been wounded and broken. This Viking fleet then moved towards Anglesey, but were repulsed shortly afterwards. While the rest of Britain and Ireland were getting inundated with Norse raids and settlements for most of the 10th century, there really isn't much for the Vikings in Wales. The primary sources don't offer much, other than the odd raid or kidnapping and ransom of clergymen, so let's turn to archaeology. As for what archaeology can tell us about Norse activity in Wales via place names and hoards found in Wales, we have this quote from Amgueddfa Cymru. For a more realistic picture of Viking Wales, we have to turn to archaeology. Most Viking silver found in Wales has been discovered in coastal areas. St. Daniel's Monastery in Bangor has produced 2 hoards, one dated to around 925, and a small group of coins deposited about 970. The Bryn Mawr hoard of coins near Llandudno was deposited in the mid-1020s, and may be Viking booty rather than local savings, and a remarkable hoard of 5 complete Viking silver arm rings were found in the 19th century at Red Wharf Bay, Anglesey. As with all archaeology in Wales, there's still plenty to be found, so hopefully in the future we'll find more Viking treasure hoards, especially with new methods, such as this from the Research Framework for the Archaeology of Wales, 400 to 1100. New innovations in scientific dating include the potential to date field systems and ceramics. These techniques are still in development and have not yet been applied in Wales, but display significant research potential, especially for the investigation of multi-period landscapes, and should be pursued where opportunities arise in the future. The last 2 episodes I explained the ships of the Norse in the England episode and what they traded in and around Scotland for the Scottish episode. Now for a similar line of information to go alongside this video like a good side dish. Why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia to travel around Europe? What drove them to leave their native lands for other places like in Britain? It's a question with so many possible answers, with many different reasons, like how the Western Roman Empire collapsed due to a variety of reasons, or trying to organise a decent stag do with your mates. For the Norse to travel across Europe and either conquer or settle, here are some quick fire reasons. Climate, possible population increases, better farming in other places, local conflicts, etc. One possible reason I subscribe to is tales of other richer and more fertile lands, such as in Britain. Even before the Viking Age, we know that Scandinavians were trading across Europe, so Norse traders coming back to Scandinavia with tales of different and richer lands to others might have triggered that desire to explore and emigrate. Humans have a desire to explore new places or experience new things, and with the Norse, we have many tales that were passed down from oral storytelling. Of course, alongside that theory, there's many more reasons as to why the Norse settled as they did, but that would be another video to cover it in its entirety. But to end this segment from a contemporary source, the historian Dudo from the 10th century, based in Francia, has his own explanation. Quote, "These people who so instantly abandon themselves to excessive indulgence live in outrageous union with many women, and there in shameless and unlawful intercourse bred innumerable progeny. Once they have grown up, the young quarrel violently with their fathers and grandfathers, or with each other, about property, and if they increase too greatly in number and cannot acquire sufficient arable land to live on, a large group is selected by the drawing of lots according to ancient custom, who are driven away to foreign peoples and realms, so that they by fighting can gain themselves countries where they can live in continual peace." For the end of the Viking Age in Wales, as I previously quoted a secondary source for the Scottish episode on the conclusion on how the Viking Age ended, that theory I agreed with, but for Wales, if I were to pick one event to end the Viking Age in Wales, there's a battle that occurred in 1098, which is rather odd, but also ends the Viking Age in Wales in a different way, as the combatants of this battle possibly involved hardly few Welsh people, took place in a major site for Welsh history, Anglesey, the Battle of the Anglesey Sound. What makes this battle interesting and peculiar is that both armies were descendants of the Vikings, or we could argue they still are. First, there's King Magnus Barefoot, King of Norway, and then we have the Normans, who by 1098 had been ruling England for 32 years and were making inroads into Wales, driving the King Geoffrey out of his kingdom for a time, which after they briefly captured Anglesey, the Normans killed a lot of the Welsh according to John of Worcester's account. Now, it's not a huge battle compared to the battles of the First Crusade, which is ongoing at this point. However, many chroniclers give us different versions of the battle, so check the references for more information. I'm just going to quote my favourite out of the lot, from John of Worcester. "Hugh, Earl of Chester, and Hugh, Earl of Shrewsbury, led troops into the Isle of Anglesey, and massacred many of the Welsh whom they took in the island, and put out the eyes of others, having first cut off their hands and feet, and emasculated them. They also dragged from his church a priest named Kenrid, from whom the Welsh received counsel on their undertakings, and after having emasculated him and put out one of his eyes, they cut off his tongue. But on the third day, by the mercy of God, his speech was restored to him. At that time, Magnus, King of Norway, son of King Olaf, having added the Orkney and Man Isles to his domain, sailed there with a small fleet. But when he attempted to bring his ships to land, Hugh, Earl of Shrewsbury, met him with a large body of men-at-arms on the strands of the sea shore, and, as it is reported, fell by an arrow discharged by the king's own hand on the 7th day after he had treated the priest just mentioned with such barbarity. A Norman getting hit in the face with an arrow? It's ironic. That concludes how Wales resisted the Vikings. Now you'll be thinking, there's still quite a bit of the video left. Surely he's not going to have a super long segment on products of the YouTube channel like memberships or Patreon or even some sort of sponsorship or even hyping the video, etc. Nope, I have simply tricked you, the audience, because in both the previous nations I've covered, England and Scotland, there is a kingdom between the two that also existed during the Viking Age and is similar to the kingdoms in Wales, as it was also a Brythonic kingdom. The Kingdom of Strathclyde, which its territories included both modern parts of northern England and southern Scotland. It's another difficult kingdom to research as there's even less contemporary sources for Strathclyde, and you might have thought that Vikings in Scotland was hard to research. Before I move on to the Kingdom of Strathclyde, let's give Wales a rank for resisting the Vikings. Pretty much A tier based off that there were no Danelaw or Norse kingdoms established in Wales during the Viking Age. And while it's fair to say that both England and Scotland might have had to put up with more Norse raids and settlements, as it's the early Middle Ages, the idea of who resisted the Vikings the best is somewhat folly, as we don't have the full picture of what exactly was going on. If we do base it off what we know from the sources and archaeology, then Wales is still top, due to that lack of evidence and mentions of attacks and settlements from the sources. But it's fair to say that the Vikings still had an impact on how the kingdoms of Wales developed. Right, now let's move on to the Kingdom of Strathclyde. Unfortunately for Strathclyde, this kingdom didn't have a chronicle, like the Anglo-Saxon chronicles for England or the Kings of Alba for Scotland. So instead, what little we know of this kingdom comes from other accounts. To jump right into Viking activities for Strathclyde, we have one chronicle mentioning the woes the kingdom would suffer. Quote, "The Danes came with innumerable hosts to York and destroyed the city and settled in it, and this was the beginning of great suffering and misfortune to Britons." It would not just be suffering inflicted onto Strathclyde by the great heathen army, but also the Norse from Ireland would also attack the kingdom repeatedly. Yet the Kingdom of Strathclyde did have a sort of capital in this period of the Viking Age, known as Dumbarton, or the Fortress of the Britons. In our time, this is now called Dumbarton Castle. But like York in the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria, Dumbarton would come under siege by the Norse. For this siege, we can refer to the Irish source, the Annals of Ulster, quote, 870. Siege of Dumbarton by the Northmen, that is to say Olaf and Ivar, two kings of the Norsemen, besieged that fortress, and at the end of 4 months, destroyed the fortress and plundered it. A similar tale to Northumbrian York, only this time the Norse didn't occupy the settlement. However, they did take many captives and ship them back to Ireland, which included the royal family of Strathclyde. But the King of Strathclyde would die at the hands of the King of Scots in 827. The Siege of Dumbarton was recorded in many other British and Irish sources. The Welsh annals state, "The citadel of Dumbarton was broken by the Gentiles." The loss of such a fortress reduced the kingdom to a state of limbo, although the Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention that in 874, here the raiding army, Great Heathen Army, went from Repton, and Halfdan went with some of the raiding army in Northumbria and took winter quarters on the River Tyne. And the raiding army conquered that land, and often raiding among the Picts and among the Strathclyde Britons. So the kingdom survived the Norse destruction of Dumbarton, but even the kings who ruled into the 10th century are obscure. The other issue is that during the 10th century, the Kingdom of Strathclyde appears to be trying to exert itself and contend with the growing powers of the kingdoms of England and Scotland, as the primary sources only mention Strathclyde when there's conflict between each kingdom, rather than mentioning the Vikings, who we have some loose information on Strathclyde, keeping an alliance with some Norse kings. As with the death of the Viking King of York in 927, King Aethelstan of now England wasted no time in conquering the last part of the Danelaw and defeating the kings of Strathclyde and Scotland. By the year of 945, information was just as scarce for Strathclyde as before, as this extract from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles state. 945, here King Edmund, raiding across all the land of Cumbria, and ceded it to Malcolm, King of Scots, on the condition that he would be his cooperator both on sea and on land. Notice there the chronicle refers to the land as Cumbria and not as Strathclyde. Quote, "The kingdom name Strathclyde first appears in texts of English and Irish origins during the 870s. For example, Strathclyde Britons are mentioned in the common stock of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles for 875. In contrast, Cumbrian terminology is first attested in various versions of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles for 945. Latin and Norse texts support the notion that Cumbrian terminology superseded the kingdom name Strathclyde during the mid-10th century. Welsh writers were, however, unwilling to apply Cumbrian terminology to a specific northern British kingdom because the inhabitants of the various Welsh kingdoms were also Cymry. Taking all of the 10th century texts together, it is clear that the Cumbrian polity extended from the Clyde Valley to the south of the Solway. The term Cumbrian again appears during the reign of King Edgar of England. Quote, "Shortly afterwards, he sailed round the north coast of Britain with a large fleet and landed at Chester. He was met, as he had given orders, by 8 tributary kings, namely, King of the Scots, Malcolm, King of the Cumbrians, Magnus, King of several isles, and 5 others." So by the middle of the 10th century, the information we have with the Kingdom of Strathclyde is unfortunately hardly related to Norse activity in the kingdom, and with such a lack of information, I find it rather impossible to rank Strathclyde alongside the other nations due to such a lack of information. But it was still a major kingdom during the Viking Age, so it was worth showcasing. So that's the end of who resisted the Vikings in Britain the best. So to summarise the rankings, we've got Wales at the top, Scotland in the middle, and England at the bottom. The Vikings had an enormous impact on Britain and on the many kingdoms that existed in the early Middle Ages, and on how the ones that survived developed down the centuries. But the Norse also left an invaluable mark in many different ways, such as language, place names, societal and military style, which alongside the topic of this video, so thank you all for watching. That concludes this mini-series on who resisted the Vikings the best in Britain.